Some funerals bury the dead. Mine buried the truth until a single message ripped the earth wide open. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I'm 66 years old. What I'm about to tell you is not just a story of grief. It is the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. The funeral for my husband, Richard Whitfield, was the quietest day of my life. The air was sharp and cold, tugging at the black veil across my face as if the wind itself wanted me to look away from the coffin being lowered into the ground. My hands trembled against the damp soil, my heart breaking in pieces I thought could never be mended. Then, just as the pastor whispered the final words, my phone vibrated inside my purse. At first, I ignored it. Who sends messages at a burial? But the buzzing wouldn't stop. With a pounding heart, I slipped the phone out and glanced at the screen. One new message, an unknown number. I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. The world tilted beneath me. My breath caught. My fingers froze above the keys. Alive? Richard? It had to be a cruel prank. But deep in my bones, something screamed otherwise. My hands shook as I forced myself to reply. Who are you? The answer came instantly, as if the sender had been waiting. I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons. My vision blurred. My chest ached as if icy claws were tearing it apart. I lifted my eyes to the graveside. My two sons, Daniel and Thomas, stood stiffly beside the casket. Their faces were masks. Tears fell, yes, but they seemed too perfectly placed. Their hugs earlier had been rehearsed, their words flat. Their grief felt artificial. For 42 years, Richard had been my partner, my anchor, my reason to breathe. We'd met when I was 24, two kids from the same dusty small town, clinging to nothing but modest dreams. I cleaned houses to support my ailing mother. Richard repaired bicycles in the small shop his father had left him. We had no riches, but we had something greater, real love. I still remember the first time he spoke to me, a Tuesday morning. I wore a faded green dress, carrying a basket of laundry to the market. He stepped out of his shop with grease-stained hands, sweat dampening his shirt, and yet his smile, shy, warm, genuine, lit up my whole world. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said softly. "Need me to check your bike?" I didn't even own a bike, but I made up an excuse, desperate for another moment with him. That excuse turned into long evenings beneath the old oak tree in the town square, into promises whispered under starlight, into a small wedding stitched together with hope. Our first home was nothing more than 2 rooms under a tin roof that leaked whenever it rained, but laughter filled the air. The love between us was richer than gold. When Daniel was born, joy burst inside me like fireworks. 2 years later, Thomas arrived, just as perfect. Richard adored them. He took them fishing on Sundays, fixed their toys when they broke, spun bedtime stories with a voice full of wonder. I cooked, cleaned, and sewed clothes for neighbors. Richard worked until his hands bled. Together, we raised our boys in love as wide as the sky. Or at least, I believed we had. They say money changes people. I learned money doesn't change you. It reveals you. Daniel was the first to change. At 16, he sneered at our small house. "Why don't we have a car like the other families?" he asked. That night, Richard smiled patiently and tapped his chest. "Son, happiness isn't parked in a driveway. It's built right here." But Daniel didn't believe him. At 18, when Richard offered him a place in the shop, Daniel shoved the offer away. "I'm not breaking my back fixing bikes like you, Dad. I'm going to be someone important." Richard never argued, but I saw the pain in his eyes. At night, he'd sit on the porch, staring at the stars. shoulders heavy with a wound he couldn't put into words. Years passed. Daniel became a real estate agent. Thomas followed, always his shadow. Money flowed quickly into their lives. Sleek cars, tall houses, sharp suits. But as their fortunes grew, so did the distance between us. At first, I felt pride. My sons had built lives we'd never dreamed of. But phone calls grew shorter, visits rarer. When they did come home, their eyes wandered over our peeling paint, our worn curtains, not with love, not with nostalgia, but with shame. "Mom," Daniel said one evening, his arm around his elegant city wife, Victoria Langley, "you and Dad should move. This place is falling apart." Richard's hand found mine under the table, squeezing. His silence was louder than anger. Our house might have been small, but within its walls we had built our lives. That night, he whispered over coffee, "Eleanor, money has stolen our boys. We're not enough for them anymore." I told him he was wrong. I told myself they were just busy. But deep down, I knew he was right. The change became permanent when Daniel married Victoria. She wore wealth like armor. The first time she visited our home, her crimson designer heels sank into the dirt of our porch. Her smile was stiff, her handshake limp, as if touching me were beneath her. At dinner, she picked at the food I'd prepared with love. Daniel leaned toward her and whispered, "Next time, we'll just take them to a restaurant." That night, something inside me cracked. Thomas remained single, but he was no different. Always busy, always leaving early, always half present. Christmases became formal exchanges of expensive gifts. Birthdays were missed, excuses polished. One night, Richard sat with me on the porch, his voice tired. "Eleanor, it's not that they have money. It's that money convinced them we don't matter anymore." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. I thought betrayal would come from strangers. I never imagined it would stand at my husband's grave, wearing the faces of my own sons. By the time Richard turned 70, the vultures circled. Daniel came with paperwork, ready to sign away our home. "This place isn't worth much, but if you sell, we'll add money. You can move somewhere better." Richard's voice was iron. "This is our home. We're not selling." Thomas chimed in, "Dad, you should retire. The shop's too dangerous at your age." Their words sounded caring, but the impatience beneath them chilled me. Not long after, Daniel and Victoria bought a mansion in the city. Thomas purchased a luxury condo. They had everything except love for the people who raised them. Then came the Tuesday morning call. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband's been in an accident. Please come to the hospital immediately." When I saw Richard, my legs almost gave way. He lay beneath machines, his body swathed in bandages. Daniel and Thomas were already there. But how? The hospital had called me first. "A machine exploded at the shop," Daniel explained. His voice was calm, too calm. For 3 days, I stayed at Richard's side. But Daniel and Thomas spent more time whispering with doctors, flipping through papers, asking about insurance. Insurance, while their father fought for his life. On the third night, Richard squeezed my hand. His lips trembled as if he tried to speak. The nurses dismissed it as a reflex, but I knew. He was trying to warn me. 2 days later, at 4:37 a.m., Richard was pronounced dead. And yet, 3 days later, at his funeral, standing by his grave, my phone said otherwise. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. Don't trust our sons." I buried my husband once. But what if the grave held not a body, but a lie? When death leaves questions, money often holds the answers. And the first cracks in my son's story began not at the grave, but in the bank. I barely slept after Richard's funeral. The pastor's words still clung to the air, but louder than scripture were the words glowing on my phone. I'm alive. Don't trust our sons. For 2 nights, I sat awake in my living room, staring at that message until the numbers blurred. Was I clinging to the impossible, or had Richard really reached out from somewhere? It was Helen Moore, my oldest friend, who finally said what I was too afraid to voice. Ellie, she whispered over tea, men like Richard don't just vanish in accidents. He was too careful, too steady. If your gut says something's wrong, trust it. Her words stayed with me. A week later, I walked into First National Bank, the same brick building where Richard and I had kept our modest savings for 30 years. The manager, Mrs. Thompson, recognized me instantly. "Oh, Mrs. Whitfield," she said softly. "I'm so sorry about Richard. He was a good man." "Thank you," I murmured, clutching my purse. "I need to check on our accounts." She led me into her office, papers stacked neatly, the faint smell of coffee in the air. She pulled out our statements for the last 6 months, but Richard had never mentioned this. Every bill, every coin he accounted for. "Who authorized these?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Your husband," Mrs. Thompson replied gently. "He came in personally, said the money was for repairs at the shop." Repairs? Richard told me everything. There had been no mention of repairs. "Do you have signatures?" I asked. She handed me the slips. The signatures looked like Richard's, but they were shaky, uneven, nothing like his firm hand. My heart pounded. "And," Mrs. Thompson added, frowning, "once or twice he came with your son Daniel. Said Richard had trouble reading the paperwork without his glasses." My chest squeezed. Richard never struggled with documents. He wore his glasses from morning until night. He didn't need Daniel to help. I folded the papers and slid them into my purse. That night, alone at the kitchen table, I compared those signatures to the letters Richard had written me over the years. The difference was undeniable. My phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number. "Check the insurance." It was their idea. A trap. The lies weren't carved in stone. They were scribbled in bank slips and insurance papers, and my son's fingerprints were all over them. The next day, I searched Richard's old desk at the shop. Dust clung to the drawers. But tucked inside a tin box, I found what I feared. A life insurance policy, updated 6 months earlier. Coverage increased from $5,000 to $50,000. A workers' compensation policy, purchased just 2 months before his death. Payout: $15,000 for an accidental workplace death. Why would Richard suddenly raise his insurance at his age without telling me? My stomach knotted. And, hidden beneath loose receipts, I found a note in Richard's handwriting. "Daniel insists I need more insurance, says it's for Eleanor's protection. But something feels wrong. I don't trust his intentions." I pressed the paper to my chest, my tears falling on the faded ink. Richard had doubted them. He had sensed the danger. Later that evening, Daniel appeared at my door with his wife, Victoria. He carried a bottle of wine. She wore her smile like a mask. "Mom," Daniel began smoothly, "I know things have been hard, but the insurance money is processing. You'll be comfortable now." "Comfortable?" I asked coldly. "Do you know the exact amount?" His eyes flickered with something sharp, before settling back into a smile. "Around 15,000. Enough for you to move to a better place." My heart clenched. How could he already know the numbers? "And what should I do with that money?" I pressed. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Invest. Or better yet, move into a retirement community. Safer. Easier. And Thomas and I could manage your money. Make it grow. Manage my money." Victoria chimed in sweetly. "It would be for your own good." Their voices dripped with concern, but their eyes gleamed with calculation. When they left, I locked the door and sank into my chair, shaking. That night, another message arrived on my phone. Don't eat or drink what they give you. Next time, they'll try again. I thought grief was my greatest enemy. I was wrong. It was the smiling faces calling me mom. Betrayal isn't always shouted. It creeps in through whispers, forged papers, and the trembling voice of a child who knows too much. After Daniel and Victoria left that night, their polished words still echoed in my mind. Retirement community. Manage your money. Safer for you. Safer. The word tasted bitter. I lay awake until dawn. Richard's note clutched in my hand, my phone glowing beside me. The unknown sender hadn't messaged again, but I no longer needed proof that something was wrong. My sons weren't grieving. They were planning. And then came the first real crack in their perfect mask. 3 days later, Thomas arrived at my house, carrying a bouquet of lilies. His smile was strained. "How are you, Mom?" he asked softly. Setting the flowers on the table, I studied him, trying to see the boy I'd raised, the boy who used to beg Richard to tell him one more bedtime story. All I saw was a man shifting uncomfortably in his expensive shoes. "I'm managing," I replied. His eyes darted to the kitchen counter. "Is that the paperwork Daniel brought? For the house?" I stiffened. "What house?" Thomas froze. Too late, he realized he had said something I hadn't. "Don't play games with me," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why do you both keep pushing me to sell our home? Why now, after your father is barely in the ground?" His jaw tightened. "Mom, you can't live in the past forever. Dad is gone. This house is falling apart. We're just trying to help." Help. That word again. But his eyes betrayed him. Behind the feigned concern, there was impatience, pressure, greed. When he left, I found myself shaking so hard I had to grip the sink. They weren't just circling me, they were tightening the noose. It's one thing to suspect betrayal. It's another to see it written in your son's eyes. That evening, I heard a small knock at my back door. When I opened it, my grandson Ethan stood there. His school backpack slung over one shoulder. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes darting nervously. "Grandma," he whispered, glancing behind him. "Can I come in?" I nodded, pulling him inside. He dropped his backpack on the chair and wrung his hands. I heard Dad and Uncle Thomas talking. My stomach dropped. "What did you hear, sweetheart?" His voice cracked. "They said Grandpa's accident wasn't really an accident. They said you'd believe anything they told you." The room spun. I clutched the edge of the table. "Ethan, are you sure?" He nodded hard. They were in Dad's office. I was supposed to be asleep, but I snuck out to get my toy. Dad said something about the insurance money. Uncle Thomas said you'd be too sad to notice. Grandma. His little eyes filled with tears. "I think they hurt Grandpa." I pulled him into my arms, my chest heaving. The words of the mysterious texts echoed in my mind. "Don't trust our sons." The next morning, Helen Moore came by with a casserole, her way of checking on me. When I told her what Ethan had said, she put a hand over her mouth. "Eleanor, this is bigger than grief. You need to be careful. If Ethan overheard, he could be in danger too." Her words cut like ice. That night, my phone buzzed again. "Go to the shop. Look in Richard's desk. You'll find more." So I did. I waited until the house was dark, then slipped out with a flashlight. The shop smelled of oil and old wood, everything frozen as Richard had left it. In his desk drawer, hidden beneath receipts, I found another note in his handwriting. "Thomas brought me papers to sign. said it was for modernization of the shop. But I don't understand what it means. Why all the rush? Why the secrecy? And beneath it, an envelope with my name. Inside was a letter. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I don't know what, but I fear our sons have been led down a dangerous path. Daniel insists on more insurance. Thomas follows. I can't explain it, but I feel they are planning something. Be strong, my love, and trust your instincts. Don't let them fool you. I sank onto the shop stool, the letter pressed to my chest. Richard had seen it coming. He had left me breadcrumbs. The dead don't speak unless we choose to listen. And Richard was screaming at me from beyond the grave. Accidents can be explained. Poison cannot. And the truth waiting in that police file was darker than any grief I had ever known. The letter Richard left me haunted my every breath. Be strong, my love. Don't let them fool you. For days, I replayed Ethan's trembling voice in my head, his wide eyes brimming with fear. Grandma, I think they hurt Grandpa. I knew I needed answers. Not guesses, not suspicions. Proof. That's when the messages came again. Go to the police station. Ask for the report. The truth isn't in the shop. It's in the blood. I walked into the Springfield Police Department with my heart pounding like a drum. The receptionist directed me to Inspector Graham Doyle, a man I'd known for years, who had once shaken Richard's hand at the town fair. Mrs. Whitfield, he said warmly, though his brows furrowed, I'm sorry again for your loss. How can I help? I swallowed hard. I'd like a copy of my husband's accident report from the shop explosion. His face stiffened. He leaned back in his chair. Explosion? What explosion? My blood went cold. The one Daniel said caused Richard's death, at the bike shop. Inspector Doyle shook his head. We have no record of any explosion at the Whitfield shop. No fire reports, no safety calls. Nothing. My throat closed. Then how did my husband come into the hospital? He rifled through a file. According to the medical intake, he arrived unconscious with signs of. He paused, frowning. Methanol poisoning. The room spun. Poisoning? I whispered. Yes, traces of methanol. It can mimic strokes or heart attacks. In high enough doses, it causes blindness, brain damage, death. My knees gave out and I gripped the edge of his desk. Why wasn't I told? His eyes softened. The family who signed the hospital forms requested confidentiality. They said you were too fragile to handle technical details. Family. My sons, Daniel and Thomas. They hadn't just lied about the accident. They had buried the truth under forged sympathy. It wasn't metal and fire that killed Richard. It was poison, poured in silence by hands I once held as a mother. I stumbled out of the station into the raw afternoon air, clutching the file. My mind was on fire. That evening, Thomas came by again, this time with coffee and pastries from the downtown bakery. His smile was warm, his tone rehearsed. Mom, you've been so tense. Let's sit down, eat something. You need strength. I remembered the text message. Don't eat or drink what they give you. I pushed the coffee away. I'm not hungry. Thomas's smile faltered. Mom, you have to take care of yourself. Dad would want that. Dad. The word stabbed me. How dare he use Richard's name with poisoned lips? Before I could respond, my phone vibrated in my lap. Another message from the unknown number. Don't drink it. They'll try again tonight. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping. I'm tired. Please leave. Thomas hesitated, then nodded and gathered the untouched pastries. But I saw it, the flicker of frustration in his eyes. As soon as the door shut, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my phone. That night, Jonathan Pierce, a private investigator, showed up at my doorstep. A tall man in his 50s, gray at the temples, eyes sharp as glass. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, lowering his voice. "Richard hired me 3 weeks before his death." My breath caught. "What?" He opened a leather folder. Inside were audio recordings, financial records, photographs. "Your husband suspected something. He asked me to watch Daniel and Thomas quietly. He didn't know exactly what they were planning, but he feared the worst." He pressed play on a recorder. Richard's familiar voice filled the air, rough with worry. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Daniel keeps pushing insurance. Thomas asks about my routine, what I eat, when I leave. It doesn't feel like love. It feels like a countdown." I clutched the table, tears spilling freely. Hearing Richard's voice was like having him alive again. Except every word confirmed my nightmares. Jonathan clicked to another file. Daniel's voice, cold, businesslike. "We can't wait anymore. He's suspicious. The methanol works. Symptoms look natural. Once Dad's gone, Mom will be easy. She'll believe anything." My stomach churned. Then Thomas's voice, "We'll make it look like depression. Widow can't cope. No one will question it." The room tilted. My babies, my boys, plotting murder as if it were an investment strategy. I thought losing Richard was the end of grief. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of war. Jonathan leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, you have enough evidence to go to the district attorney, but you need to act quickly. They're already preparing paperwork to declare you incompetent." I stared at him, my fists trembling. "They want my house, my money, my silence. They want your life," he corrected grimly. That night, as I lay in bed, the shadows of my son's voices echoed in the dark. Ethan's tearful warning, the forged signatures, the poison. I realized there was no turning back. I could no longer hope they would return to the boys I once raised. They were gone. What remained were predators wearing the faces of my children. A mother's love had kept me blind. They planned to take my house, my money, my mind. But that night, I learned something they never counted on. Grief can turn a widow into a warrior. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with Jonathan's recorder, Richard's letter, and a pen that shook in my hand. Every so often, I'd look at the doorway, imagining Richard stepping in with his familiar creak on the floorboard, asking if I wanted tea. The house felt different now, not empty, but alert, like it was listening. At 7:10 a.m., Jonathan texted, "DA can see us at 9. Inspector Doyle will meet us there." I changed into my navy suit, my serious day clothes, and tucked Richard's letter into my handbag like armor. At the county district attorney's office, the conference room was ice cold and windowless, a place built for hard truths. Assistant DA Claire Monroe sat across from me, sharp eyes, steady voice. Inspector Doyle leaned against a cabinet, arms folded, jaw set. Jonathan laid out the case, the methanol intake notation, bank withdrawals, the audio files of Daniel and Thomas, the falsified accident story, and Richard's medical exam showing he'd been healthy 3 days before he fell ill. Claire listened without interrupting. When Jonathan finished, she clicked her pen once and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I can proceed on probable cause today, search warrants, preservation orders, and an emergency petition to protect you. But we'll need the medical cornerstone, confirmation of methanol levels. That means the medical examiner will have to exhume Richard." I didn't flinch. "Do it." She nodded. "We'll also need to preempt the move your sons are making. You'll likely be served today or tomorrow with a petition to declare you incapacitated. It'll be backed by a physician's letter." "Dr. Victor Albright," I said quietly, Daniel's wife's uncle. "He's never examined me." Doyle exhaled through his nose. "Makes sense," Claire said. "Here's our plan. 1. We file for a protective order and a temporary injunction preventing the sale or encumbrance of your property and freezing withdrawals on your accounts. 2. We serve preservation notices to hospitals, the funeral home, and the clinic Richard visited before his death. 3. We file ex parte to pause any guardianship petition until you have counsel and a neutral psychiatric evaluation. Jonathan slid a document toward me. 1 more layer. Grant me temporary agency to coordinate your security. If they panic, they might try to corner you, or worse. I signed. Corner me where? In my own kitchen? Claire's eyes met mine. We'll put a patrol car near your street. Don't be alone with them. If they come, step outside. Call 911 and keep your phone recording. I nodded, memorizing each instruction the way I used to memorize recipes. By noon, the orders were in motion. Doyle had sent the preservation notices. Claire had a judge's signature on the temporary injunction. The wheels of justice had finally started to turn. When the truth finally finds its voice, the first thing it does is protect your breath. I got home just after 1. The sky had that pale winter glare that makes everything look like a photograph. I'd barely set my keys down when a silver SUV pulled up fast, gravel spitting under the tires. Daniel, Thomas, and of course, Dr. Victor Albright stepped out. Thomas carried a paper bag from a bakery. Daniel held a manila envelope. Dr. Albright had a leather briefcase and a certain smugness that comes from writing reports about people you've never met. They didn't knock. They walked in. My house. My air. "Mom," Daniel announced, voice syrupy. "We brought lunch, and Dr. Albright wanted to check on you, just to see how you're coping." I set my phone on the counter. Camera facing the room, recording. "I'm coping by breathing," I said, "and by choosing my company." Dr. Albright gave me a pitying smile. "Grief can be terribly disorienting. Your sons tell me you've been confused, visiting the police, asking odd questions." "I'm not confused," I said. "I'm concerned." Thomas slid the bakery bag toward me. "Your favorite almond pastries and some coffee from Blackbird Roasters. You have to eat, Mom." I didn't touch either. "Leave it there." Daniel placed the manila envelope on the table, tapping it with 2 fingers. "We've drafted some papers to help with the overwhelm. Temporary financial management, voluntary care plan. Just signatures, Mom. For your own good." "For your good," I said evenly. I looked at Dr. Albright. "How many reports have you authored about my mind, Doctor?" He blinked. "My role is advisory. Your sons described a pattern." "Based on what?" "Because I asked why the shop has no scorch marks. Because I asked why you ordered a simple funeral with no one allowed to see Richard's body. Because I asked the police why there was no explosion report." The room tightened. Thomas's jaw worked. Daniel's smile thinned. Albright adjusted his cufflinks. "I'm going to make some tea," I said, moving slowly to the kettle. "Daniel, why don't you tell Dr. Albright how you were at the hospital before I'd even been called, or how you inquired about life insurance while your father was still breathing?" Thomas spoke up. "Mom, you're spiraling. This is exactly what Dr. Albright warned us about. We can file for a compassionate guardianship. That way you don't have to worry about forms and bills." And I turned, meeting his eyes. "And breakfast? Should I worry about breakfast?" Silence. Even the kettle seemed to hold its breath. Thomas swallowed. "What are you implying?" I didn't answer. I walked to the counter and with deliberate care pushed the bakery bag and the coffee to the far end, out of my reach, out of theirs. Daniel forced a chuckle. "Mom, enough theatrics. Just sign the care plan." I glanced at my phone screen. The little red recording light winked back at me. "Sit down," I said. My voice surprised me. Steady, cold, final. All three of you. They sat. I reached into my handbag and placed a copy of the court's temporary injunction on the table. Effective as of 11:47 a.m. today, none of you may access or move my funds, sell my home, or alter any of my accounts. Any attempt will be considered interference and reported. Daniel's face flushed. What is this? Protection, I said. I slid another paper forward. Also, an ex parte stay halting any guardianship action until a neutral psychiatric examination. Not a relative, not a friend, neutral. Albright's nostrils flared. This is irregular. This is legal, I said. I'm sure you'll appreciate the difference. Thomas half rose from his chair. You went to the DA? I didn't answer him. Instead, I tapped the phone on the table. I've learned to record important conversations. Helps with my so-called memory. Daniel leaned forward, his mask slipping. Mom, listen to me. If you keep this up, you'll make things worse for everyone. For everyone, I repeated. Meaning, for you. He exhaled sharply. Meaning for the family, for reputations. You'll look unwell publicly. You'll humiliate Dad's memory. And there it was, the twist of the knife. They always aimed for shame. Humiliation, I said softly, is burying your husband under a lie. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The kettle clicked. I poured water, slow, loud, deliberate, and let the steam curl between us like a veil. Then I reached for the old portable speaker Richard kept by the radio, paired it to Jonathan's recorder, and pressed play. Richard's voice filled my kitchen. Steady, weary, unmistakably him. Jonathan, if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Daniel keeps pushing insurance. Thomas asks when I eat, what I drink. It feels like a countdown. Thomas's face drained of color. Daniel stared at the table. I clicked to the next file. Daniel's voice, crisp, clinical. We can't wait anymore. He's suspicious. Methanol looks like a stroke. Once Dad's gone, Mom will be easy. Dr. Albright shifted, suddenly fascinated by the floor. I let the next clip land like a hammer. Thomas, brittle and breathless. Widow can't cope is believable. Depression. No one will dig. Then the last one, the one that had kept me awake all night. Both of them, low and urgent, after the payout. We get Mon's house transferred. If she resists, we push guardianship. And if she still fights, then we make it look like grief. No one spoke. A fly ticked against the window pane, blind and stubborn. I clicked stop. You will leave my house now. Daniel looked up slowly, eyes hard. You can't prove when those were recorded. You can't prove anything. You're right, I said. I can't. But a judge can. The DA can. And the medical examiner can. When he exhumes Richard and tests his blood. Thomas flinched. You approved an exhumation? Yes, I said, voice like glass. Because love isn't scared of the truth. Only guilt is. Albright stood abruptly, clutching his briefcase. I won't be part of this theatrical ambush. Doctor, I said without looking at him, you have signed a letter about my mind. The DA will want to know what you were paid and by whom. He hesitated, then turned and walked out. Thomas followed, rattled. We should go. Daniel didn't move. He stared at me with the peculiar mixture of contempt and calculation I had once mistaken for confidence. You think you've won because you found a tape recorder, he said quietly. But judges understand grief. They understand confusion. They understand old age. I stepped closer. They also understand bank withdrawals you lied about. A death certificate that doesn't match hospital intake. And a widow who refused coffee. He blinked. I gestured toward the bag on the counter. Take your pastries, I said. Throw them away. somewhere far from my house. And then, almost as if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Inspector Doyle stood on the porch with another officer behind him. His gaze slid to Daniel, then to the bag of food, then to my phone with its red recording light. "Afternoon," he said mildly. "Just checking on Mrs. Whitfield. We've had concerns." Daniel swallowed. "We were just leaving." "I thought you might be," Doyle said. They filed out, stiff and brittle. When the door closed, the house exhaled. I leaned on the counter, shaking. Doyle's tone softened. "You did well. You didn't eat, you didn't sign, and you didn't argue more than necessary." He nodded toward the pastries. "Mind if we take those? Chain of custody." "Please," I whispered. He bagged the food and coffee with practiced hands, reading me as he worked. "Exhumation is scheduled for first light tomorrow," he said. "Claire will call you tonight." I nodded, relief and dread twining like vines. "Thank you." He paused at the door. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "Yes?" He glanced at the little speaker. "For what it's worth, your husband sounds like the kind of man who makes good plans." "He did," I said, my voice breaking. "And this is the last one I'll keep. When predators realize the sheep has grown teeth, they stop whispering and start running. That's when you know the hunt has turned." They didn't come back that day. But at 6:32 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown caller. I let it go to voicemail. When the alert chimed, I played it on speaker. Daniel's voice, forced calm. "Mom, we're concerned about your choices. If you keep talking to strangers and police, we'll be forced to proceed tomorrow morning. Judge Miller knows our family. He'll understand we're trying to protect you." I texted the message to Claire and Jonathan. Jonathan replied instantly. "Do not respond. We'll be there at 9 a.m. If they try an emergency hearing, we'll meet them in court." I spent the evening at Doris's house next door. We played at being normal. Chicken soup, soft music, but I ate little and talked less. At 9, I went home, locked the doors, and laid Richard's letter on my nightstand. I read it twice. "Be strong, my love. Don't let them fool you." At 2:03 a.m., a car slowed in front of my house. Headlights parked across the street, engine idling a long minute, then rolling on. I watched from behind the curtain with the phone in my hand and the recorder beside me. Not paranoid, prepared. Dawn came blue and thin. I dressed in black slacks and a gray blazer, pinned my hair up, put on the small silver locket Richard had given me the day Ethan was born. Inside was a photo of Richard holding the squirming baby and grinning like a boy. At 7:15 a.m., Claire called. "The Emmys team is on site," she said gently. "We'll have preliminary tox findings by afternoon. Full panel soon after." "Thank you," I said. The words felt small, next to the size of the moment. At 9:02, I walked into the courthouse with Jonathan at my side. Claire waited near the elevators with a folder tucked under her arm. Her eyes flicked past me and sharpened. "Here they come. Daniel, Thomas, Dr. Albright, and a slick man I didn't recognize approached. Attorney Craig Leland, by the look of the monogrammed briefcase. Daniel wore a navy suit and an expression that might pass for solemn. Thomas looked sleep-deprived. Albright had the faint, splotchy color of a man who'd faced consequences in a mirror and didn't like what he saw. "Mrs. Whitfield," Leland said smoothly, "we're here for a brief, compassionate guardianship hearing. No contest necessary. We're offering a dignified solution." Claire stepped in. "There will be no guardianship hearing today. My office has already filed a stay pending a neutral evaluation. Additionally, we have active criminal inquiries. Any coercion, financial or otherwise, will be presented as evidence." Leland's smile didn't reach his eyes. "On what basis?" Claire slid a copy of the temporary injunction across the counter. "On this basis." Daniel tried to speak, but Claire continued, voice calm and edged. And before you ask, yes, we're aware of Dr. Albright's letter. We'll be filing a complaint with the state medical board concerning his evaluation. The board tends to frown on diagnoses made in living rooms over pastries. A flicker, just a flicker, ran through Thomas's face. Leland tried again. We have concerns for Mrs. Whitfield's judgment. Jonathan spoke for the first time, voice mild. Then you'll love what the medical examiner retrieves this afternoon. We held each other's gaze in that fluorescent hallway, the two sides of a broken family, each carrying our chosen weapons. They had signatures and smiles. We had time-stamped files and clean, lined orders stamped by a judge. Daniel recovered first. Fine, he said tightly. We can wait. You'll have to, Claire said. They left in a cluster, like weather breaking. I sat on a hard bench outside the clerk's office, hands folded in my lap. Doris texted me a string of hearts and a photo of Ethan's crayon drawing from school, a stick figure grandma with a superhero cape. I laughed and cried at once. The sound scared me, then it steadied me. At 3:41 p.m., Claire called. Preliminary talks is back, she said quietly. The medical examiner found elevated methanol consistent with poisoning. I closed my eyes, and the world went silent in a way that wasn't shock. It was completion. The loop closed, the lie cracked, the grave gave up the truth. Thank you, I said, 2 words again, and still not enough. Claire's tone shifted, firmer, lighter. We'll be moving for arrest warrants within hours. Stay home. Keep your doors locked. Jonathan will be with you. I hung up and stared at Richard's name on the court printout Jonathan had shown me earlier. Whitfield, Richard, examination ordered. Cold type. Holy proof. When we got back to the house, Jonathan brewed tea, real tea, from my own tin, while I stood at the sink staring at the lilacs outside the window. You did it, he said softly, sliding the mug to me. No, I said. We did. Richard did. I touched the locket. He warned me. You believed him. Jonathan nodded. He trusted your courage more than his luck. Lights flicked across the window. 2 squad cars eased down the road and parked out of sight. A neighbor's dog barked. Once, then twice, then settled. The house listened again. At 6:07 p.m., a text lit my phone. Unknown. You're making a mistake. We can still fix this. Think of Ethan. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I put the phone face down and turned to the window where the lilacs swayed like small, stubborn flags. The grave had spoken, and the truth had a badge. By nightfall, my sons would learn the one lesson money never teaches. There is a cost you cannot afford. A grave can hold silence, but a body, it holds truth. And when the earth opened, justice finally breathed. By dawn, my street looked like any other. Lawns damp with dew, curtains still drawn, birds calling thinly in the gray light. But inside my chest, war drums pounded. Today was the day. At 8:15 a.m., Inspector Graham Doyle knocked gently. Behind him stood 2 detectives in plain clothes, their faces set like stone. Mrs. Whitfield, Doyle said, we'll need you to stay inside today. The warrants have been signed. Daniel and Thomas will be taken into custody. My breath caught. I pressed a hand to my locket. It's really happening? He nodded. And the medical examiner's full toxicology report is in. He didn't have to say more. My knees weakened. Jonathan guided me to a chair before Doyle slid the file across the table. In black and white, it was there. Methanol toxicity. Levels consistent with ingestion prior to death. Cause, poisoning. Manner, homicide. The room swayed. Richard's death certificate, once a bland slip of paper, had been rewritten in fire. You can bury a man, but you cannot bury poison. It seeps through the earth until it reaches the light. At 9:42 a.m., the first arrest unfolded. I watched from the upstairs window as Daniel, still in his pressed suit, stepped out of his SUV with a leather briefcase. He looked surprised to see the patrol cars waiting, but he recovered quickly, his face stretching into a politician's smile. "Officers," he said smoothly, "there must be some mistake." Doyle read him his rights. His smile faltered only when the words "charged with homicide" hit the air. Victoria came running down the driveway in her robe, shouting that it was harassment, that her husband was a respected businessman. But the neighbors had gathered, whispering, recording. For the first time, Daniel couldn't control the narrative. At 10:27 a.m., Thomas was pulled from his condo. Unlike Daniel, he didn't fight. He looked pale, crumpled, like a boy caught stealing instead of a man accused of killing. Both were taken away in separate cruisers. I stood behind the curtain, tears sliding hot and relentless. Not joy, not victory, a grief deeper than the grave. Later that afternoon, Jonathan drove me to the county morgue. The medical examiner, a composed woman named Dr. Patel, met us in a sterile white room where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said gently, "I know this is difficult, but Richard's body confirmed what the preliminary tests suggested." She showed me the charts, the numbers, elevated methanol, no signs of explosion injuries, no burns, no trauma. Instead, clear chemical poisoning. My hands shook as I reached for the edge of the table. Richard's face, serene in the casket, flashed in my mind. He had tried to warn me, even as his body betrayed him. Dr. Patel added softly, "It appears he ingested it in liquid form, disguised. Possibly coffee or wine." Coffee. I remembered Thomas pushing the cup toward me at the kitchen table. My stomach twisted so violently, I had to grit Jonathan's arm. Richard had drunk what I refused, and it had killed him. I thought I buried my husband. What I really buried was their weapon. The funeral home director later confirmed Daniel and Thomas had insisted on a closed casket service, citing trauma from the explosion. That's why no one, no friend, no neighbor, not even me, had seen Richard's body before burial. Every piece clicked into place. Every lie stacked like bricks on my chest. Jonathan looked at me, his eyes steady. "You were right to question. You were right not to drink." But all I felt was a roar of guilt. Why hadn't I fought harder at the hospital? Why hadn't I screamed louder when Richard squeezed my hand, tried to warn me? That night, I sat by the window with Ethan curled beside me, his little hand clutching mine. He whispered, "Grandpa would be proud of you." Tears slipped down my cheeks. "Grandpa would be proud of you too, sweetheart. You saved me." The next morning, the town paper ran the headline, "Whitfield brothers arrested for father's murder." Underneath, their mugshots stared out. Daniel's jaw tight with fury, Thomas's eyes hollow. By noon, Victoria had hired an attorney and was already on television, claiming her husband was innocent, that misinterpretations had been twisted into lies. But the evidence was louder than her voice. Inspector Doyle came by with an update. They're both denying it, of course. Thomas claims Daniel pressured him. Daniel claims the insurance was his father's idea. But the recordings, the withdrawals, the toxicology, it's airtight. I nodded numbly. What happens next? They'll be arraigned tomorrow. Then trial prep begins. But Eleanor, his voice softened. This doesn't have to define you. You stopped them before they reached you. That matters. I looked at Richard's photo on the mantel. His steady eyes, his quiet smile. I didn't stop them soon enough. Justice had begun, but trials don't heal wounds. They only open them wider. And the next wound was waiting in my own living room. Courtrooms don't chase truth, they cage it. And when my son stood trial, I learned justice isn't blind. It just chooses what it wants to see. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and cold coffee. Reporters clustered at the steps, their microphones flashing like bayonets. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you believe your sons are guilty? Will you testify against them? How does it feel, a mother turning against her own blood?" Their questions sliced at me, but I kept walking. Jonathan shielding Ethan and me from the chaos. Inside, the heavy oak doors closed on the noise. The courtroom was already packed. Friends, neighbors, strangers, everyone wanted to see the fall of the Whitfield family. Daniel sat at the defense table in a tailored suit, his jaw clenched, eyes cold. Beside him, Victoria dabbed fake tears, whispering to his lawyer. Thomas looked smaller, shoulders hunched, his face pale. When the bailiff called, "All rise," my heart thundered so hard I thought it might betray me before I even took the stand. There's no silence like the silence of a courtroom, when everyone waits to see if blood will protect or condemn. The prosecution's case was brutal. Detectives displayed the forged insurance documents, the unsigned power of attorney drafts, the photos of Thomas handing off a package in the hospital parking lot. They played the audio Ethan had bravely recorded, Daniel's voice low, threatening. "She'll sign. She has no choice." Every word echoed like a gunshot. I saw Daniel shift, his lawyer whispering furiously. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand, my palms slick. The bailiff swore me in. I looked at Daniel, at Thomas, my boys, the children I had cradled, the men who had buried their father in lies. My husband, Richard, warned me. I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. He left notes. He squeezed my hand in the hospital. He tried to speak, but his voice was stolen. I told them about the texts, the forged forms, the poisoned coffee cup, and finally, about Ethan. My grandson was the bravest of us all. He saved my life by telling the truth his own father wouldn't. The courtroom held its breath. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it trembles, spoken by a child too young to lie. The defense attacked ruthlessly. "Mrs. Whitfield," Daniel's lawyer sneered, "isn't it true grief can cloud memory? That you were distraught, desperate, imagining things?" I lifted Richard's letter from my purse, hands steady now. "Does grief forge my husband's handwriting?" Gasps rippled through the room. Thomas's lawyer tried a different tactic. "Your younger son was manipulated by his brother. He was a follower, not the mastermind. But the evidence showed otherwise. Bank withdrawals, signatures, recorded calls. Both had blood on their hands. And then came Ethan's testimony. The judge hesitated, but after the prosecution insisted, my grandson was sworn in. His small voice trembled but carried across the silent room. I heard my dad say Grandpa's accident wasn't real. He said Grandma would believe anything. He gave him pills. I saw it. Victoria burst up, shouting, "He's a child. He's confused." The judge slammed his gavel. "One more outburst, and you'll be removed." Ethan looked at me, then at the judge. His hands shook, but his words didn't. "I'm not confused. They killed my grandpa." The courtroom erupted. When a child speaks truth, even the walls of justice have to listen. Closing arguments painted two portraits. The prosecution showed Daniel and Thomas as cold, greedy men who poisoned their own father for money. The defense painted them as devoted sons, caught in coincidence, victims of suspicion and grief. But the jury had seen the letters, the photos, the recordings. They had heard Ethan. After 6 days of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury filed back in. My hands clenched Jonathan's so tight my knuckles went white. The foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder of Richard Whitfield, we find the defendant, Daniel Whitfield, guilty. The air rushed from my lungs. On the same charge, we find the defendant, Thomas Whitfield, guilty. The room exploded with noise. Victoria collapsed, sobbing. Reporters bolted for the doors. I sat frozen. My sons, guilty. The judge's voice cut through the chaos. Sentencing will follow. Court is adjourned. Daniel turned in his chair, his eyes locking on me, full of venom. His lips formed words no one else heard. This is your fault. Thomas just lowered his head and wept. Justice had spoken, but justice doesn't heal. And when the sentence came, it would shatter what little remained of my family. Justice doesn't mend broken bloodlines. It only teaches you how deep betrayal can cut and how strong a heart must be to survive it. The day of sentencing arrived draped in rain. Drops struck the courthouse windows like a clock counting down to the end of everything. The gallery was full again. Reporters, townsfolk, strangers, all waiting to hear how long my sons would spend in cages of their own making. Daniel walked in first, shackled, jaw set in stubborn pride. He refused to look at me. Thomas followed, thinner than before, his eyes hollow, rimmed red. He looked like he hadn't slept since the verdict. Judge Doyle's gavel struck. The room quieted. Some silences weigh heavier than words, like the silence before a judge decides if your children will ever walk free again. The prosecutor spoke briefly, reminding the court of the evidence, the planning, the cold deliberation. The defense begged for leniency, claimed Daniel acted out of financial desperation, Thomas out of brotherly loyalty. But the judge was unmoved. Daniel Whitfield and Thomas Whitfield, he intoned, you poisoned your own father, a man who loved you, to collect money not worth a fraction of his life. You plotted to declare your mother insane to steal what remained. Your greed destroyed a family and shocked a community. For the crime of first-degree murder and conspiracy, this court sentences you both to life imprisonment, with parole eligibility after 30 years. Gasps filled the room. Victoria sobbed, collapsing against the bench. Daniel's face drained of color. Thomas began to cry silently, his chains rattling. I sat still, not triumphant, not broken, just emptied. My sons had chosen their path. The gavel only sealed it. Justice doesn't celebrate, it mourns, because every sentence is a gravestone over what might have been. Weeks later, I received my first letter from prison. It was Thomas, his handwriting shaky, the ink smudged. Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I was weak. I followed Daniel when I should have stood up. I can't undo what I did, but please believe I never stopped loving Dad, and I never stopped loving you. I cried as I read it, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Love without loyalty is just another lie. 2 months later, another letter came, this time from Daniel. His tone was venomous. You betrayed me. You chose strangers and cops over your own blood. You'll die alone, old woman, and it'll be your fault. I burned that letter in the fireplace. Ashes for ashes. Some words heal. Others deserve nothing but fire. Life after the trial was quieter, but not empty. Jonathan visited often, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with coffee. He never asked for anything, only sat with me on the porch, telling stories about cases, reminding me life wasn't only about endings, but about new beginnings. Helen, my loyal friend, became my anchor. She never let a day pass without checking on me, reminding me that family is chosen as much as it is born. And Ethan, my brave grandson, grew stronger. Therapy helped him process the betrayal of hearing his own father's voice plotting death. But his courage remained unshaken. Sometimes he'd sit in Richard's old chair, fiddling with the tools his grandfather once used, whispering, "I'll build things like Grandpa did. I won't be like Dad." That promise healed wounds words alone never could. Betrayal may pass through generations, but so can courage. On the 5th anniversary of Richard's death, I turned the old shop into a garden. Sunflowers stretched toward the sky, roses bloomed in defiance of storms, and a bench sat where his work table once stood. Every Sunday, I carried fresh flowers to his grave. On the stone I'd had inscribed, "Richard Whitfield, beloved husband, betrayed father, honorable man." His love was stronger than death. Sometimes, I swear I felt his presence in the breeze, like a quiet whisper, telling me he was proud. Graves don't hold the dead. They hold the stories of how fiercely they were loved. 2 years later, the Ernest Whitfield Foundation was born, funded by the blood-stained insurance money I refused to use for myself. Instead, it became a lifeline for families betrayed from within. Lawyers, investigators, counselors, all working to turn pain into justice. One day, a woman named Elaine came to me, trembling, her story echoing mine. A brother who poisoned their mother for inheritance. The foundation helped her gather proof. Her brother now sits behind bars. She hugged me after the sentencing, sobbing into my shoulder. "You saved my life." I whispered back, "No, truth did. I just showed you where to look." Pain can end with one family, or it can bloom into a light that saves many. Now, years later, I am 71. My hair is white, my hands worn, but my eyes shine with peace. I live in the same little house Richard and I built dreams in. The porch still creaks, the tin roof still sings in rain, but it is enough. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my sons. My answer is always the same. I miss the boys they once were, the ones who laughed in fishing boats and begged for one more bedtime story. Those boys died long before Richard did. The men they became were strangers wearing familiar faces. And strangers do not get to break me anymore. Family isn't blood. Family is who loves you when love costs everything. Would you have had the strength to stand against your own children for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments. If Eleanor's story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because more true-to-life stories like this are coming your way.